It is said that in the old days, when the rain never seemed to leave the northern lands of Persia, there came a wandering dervish named Yunis, whose footsteps were as quiet as memory, and whose gaze carried the weight of roads that never ended. Travelers once spoke of him in the caravanserai between Qazvin and the Caspian Gates, saying he arrived without announcement, and left without farewell, as though he belonged not to places but to the passing of time itself. In those days Yunis was seen approaching the city of Rasht beneath a sky that seemed to have forgotten how to be still for even a moment. The clouds hung low like heavy thoughts, and the rain fell not as violence, but as a patient sorrow that had learned to remain. The old men of the tea-houses still remember how he entered through the muddy streets barefoot, carrying only a worn cloak and a silence deeper than the sound of the river nearby. It is said that Rasht was not like other cities, for it did not greet strangers with pride or fear, but with a kind of gentle melancholy, as though it already knew everything would eventually be washed away. Yunis walked through its alleys where wet stones reflected lantern light like broken pieces of memory, and he listened not to words but to what remained unsaid between them. The bazaar was alive even in the rain, with merchants calling softly over covered goods, the scent of damp wood spices, and tea rising into the air, like a prayer that had forgotten its origin. Somewhere a stringed instrument was being played, not for celebration, but for endurance, for the musician sat beneath a tilted roof, plucking notes that seemed to fall into the street and dissolve before reaching anyone's heart. Yunis stopped there for a long time, though no one knew why, and those who noticed him later would say his eyes were not watching the musician, but something far beyond him, as if he were listening to a song that had not yet fully arrived into this world. As evening descended, Rasht grew quieter, and the rain became finer, like threads being drawn slowly through the fabric of dusk. Yunis found shelter in an old caravanserai at the edge of the city, where travelers from the sea and mountains gathered without speaking, much as though each carried stories too heavy to place on the ground. The keeper offered him bread and warm tea, and did not ask his name, for in such places names were considered unnecessary burdens. That night, while others slept, Yunis sat near the courtyard fountain, where rainwater blended with stone basin water, until neither could be distinguished, and there he closed his eyes as if trying to remember something that never fully happened. It is said that he whispered a name, though no one was near enough to hear it, and even if they had been, they might not have understood whether it belonged to a person or to a feeling that had once passed through him long ago. Outside the caravanserai walls, Rasht continued to breathe in slow rhythm, the river carrying branches, leaves, and forgotten things toward the sea, as if collecting the city's unspoken grief. Yunis listened to that movement, and for a brief moment he felt as though the river was not moving outward, but inward, drawing everything back into an origin no one could recall. The night deepened, and with it came a memory not clearly his own, but one that seemed to settle in him like borrowed pain, the memory of a song sung near water, by a voice that had once believed it would never be forgotten. Yet songs are fragile in the world of men, and what is sung with love often becomes silence more quickly than expected. Yunis opened his eyes and looked toward the direction of the river beyond the city, where the darkness was thicker, and the sound of rain merged with water, until even listening became uncertain. The narrator cannot say what stirred within him in that moment, only that he stood slowly and walked out into the rain again, as though answering something that had called him without words. And so it was that Yunis of the wandering path began to move through Rasht, not as a traveler seeking shelter, but as one following the faint echo of a song that never reached the river, though the river had always been waiting for it. It is said that when Yunis left the shelter of the caravanserai, the rain had not lessened, but had deepened into something more intimate, as though the sky had come closer to the earth to speak in a language only the quiet could understand. The streets of Rasht were nearly empty at that hour, yet not truly silent, for every surface held the memory of sound footsteps that had passed earlier, doors that had closed, voices that had faded into walls now softened by water and time. Yunis walked without haste through narrow alleys, where the lanterns flickered behind wet glass like hesitant thoughts, and the river's presence grew stronger with every step, not as a visible force, but as a pulling in the air itself, a reminder that all things here were moving towards something larger than themselves. It is said that he stopped near an old bridge where merchants once crossed with silk and salt, and where now only the rain crossed freely without resistance. There he leaned against the stone and listened to the water below, which carried branches and fragments of earth as if translating the language of distant mountains into the city's bloodstream. An old man passing by later claimed he saw Yunis standing there unmoving for so long that he mistook him for part of the bridge itself, another worn stone shaped by years of waiting. In that stillness Yunis remembered a sound not fully formed in his mind, the echo of a melody once played beside a different river in a place he could not name with certainty, though his heart insisted it had been real. The memory did not arrive as clarity, but as sensation, the weight of a voice suspended between joy and sorrow, the kind of sound that does not ask to be remembered, yet refuses to disappear. He continued walking, and the city seemed to respond not outwardly, but inwardly, as if Rasht itself were listening through its rain-soaked walls. In a small tea-house, where steam blurred the windows, he paused again, watching men bent over cups, speaking softly of weather harvests and debts, of things that mattered in the immediate sense, yet faded quickly in the larger rhythm of existence. A young musician sat in the corner, holding a sitar whose wood had darkened from years of touch and moisture, and though he played quietly, there was something unresolved in his playing, as if the notes were searching for each other, but never fully meeting. Yunis listened without interruption, and for a brief moment his eyes closed, not in sleep, but in recognition, as though the music was brushing against the same hidden memory he had been carrying since leaving the caravanserai. When he opened his eyes again, the musician had stopped, and there was a silence that felt heavier than sound, as if the absence of music had revealed something more honest than its presence. The young man noticed Yunis and offered him a cup of tea without words, and Yunis accepted, not as guest or stranger, but as one traveler acknowledging another in the shared knowledge that all journeys are ultimately solitary. Outside the rain had softened but not ceased, and the city now seemed wrapped in a kind of translucent veil, where even distant lights appeared uncertain of their own existence. Yunis stepped back into the streets and followed the direction where the river's breath was strongest, moving through passages, where water dripped from rooftops in steady rhythm like a slow counting of forgotten time. It is said that at one point he heard a woman singing from an upper window, not loudly and not for anyone in particular, but as if singing to the rain itself, or to something within it that only she could sense. The song was simple, yet it carried the weight of things unspoken, of youth that had already begun to leave, of love that had not stayed in the form it was expected to, of waiting that had become a habit rather than a hope. Yunis did not look up, but he listened fully, and as he walked on the song followed him for several steps before dissolving into the sound of water. Later, those who claimed to have seen him that night said he seemed to be walking not toward a place, but toward an absence, something just beyond the reach of the city's final street, where the river widened and lost its name in the larger sea. And it was there, in that quiet pull between water and memory, that the story of the song that never reached the river began to take its deeper shape, not as something lost, but as something continuously arriving without ever becoming complete. It is said that by the time Yunis reached the outer edges of Rasht, where the river widened and the land began to surrender itself to water, the rain had turned into a fine mist so delicate that it no longer felt like weather but like memory itself drifting through the air. The city behind him no longer appeared as a place of arrival or departure, but as something half-remembered, a gathering of sounds and lights slowly dissolving into the rhythm of the river's endless movement. There he stood for a long time at the embankment where fishermen once tied their boats, though now only the ropes remained faint marks against old wood softened by years of moisture and silence. The river did not speak, yet it carried within it a presence that felt older than speech, a continuity that made every human moment seem temporary, yet not meaningless. Yunis looked into its surface, and it is said that he did not see his reflection clearly, but rather fragments of other times flickering beneath like shadows of lives that had once leaned over the same water and asked the same unanswerable questions. In that quiet he remembered again the song, not as sound, but as something closer to breath, a melody that had once been sung beside a different river, in a season that no longer belonged to any calendar. He could not recall the face of the one who sang it, nor the exact words, only the feeling that the song had been meant to remain unfinished, as if its incompleteness was its true form. Behind him Rasht continued its slow evening rituals, distant doors closing, the soft echo of footsteps disappearing into courtyards, the low murmur of life continuing without urgency or expectation. It is said that an old boatman who watched Yunis from afar thought he was waiting for someone, but later confessed He was not certain whether Yunis was waiting for a person or for a moment that had already passed through the world and left no trace except in him. The wind moved gently along the river, bending reeds and carrying with it the scent of wet earth and wood, and something faintly reminiscent of tea and smoke from distant houses. Yunis sat down finally on a stone near the water's edge, and allowed the silence to fully settle around him, not as emptiness but as a presence that had always been there patiently waiting for acknowledgement. In that sitting, he was no longer a traveler, for travel implies direction, and direction implies desire, yet what remained in him was neither forward nor backward, but something suspended between what has been lived and what can never be returned to. The narrator cannot say how long he remained there, for in such moments time in Rasht loses its certainty and becomes indistinguishable from the river's own rhythm. At some point a distant sound of music reached him again, faint and uncertain, as if carried not by air, but by recollection itself, and he listened without turning his head, knowing that to turn would be to break the fragile balance of that moment. It is said that the sound resembled the same unfinished melody he had carried within him, yet now it was farther away than memory could comfortably reach and closer than reality could explain. As night approached, the river darkened and the mist thickened until even the far bank disappeared, as though the world had narrowed to only sound and breath. Yunis closed his eyes, and for the first time since entering Rasht, there was no searching within him, only recognition of something that had always been incomplete by nature, not by loss. The song that never reached the river was not a tragedy he understood then, but a condition of all human expression, for nothing that carries meaning ever arrives fully intact into the world it enters. When he finally rose, the ground beneath him was soft with rain, and the river continued its movement, indifferent, yet not unkind, holding within its flow all the fragments of voices that had ever approached it, and dissolved before becoming final. He began to walk again, not away from the river, but with it, as if the distinction between traveler and path had quietly dissolved. It is said that some who later spoke of Yunis believed they saw him disappearing into the mist along the river bank, while others insisted he simply continued walking until distance made him indistinguishable from the rain itself. The old men of Rasht still tell this story in quiet rooms, when the weather returns and the river rises slightly against its banks, as if remembering something it once carried but never held. And they say that if one listens carefully during such nights, a faint melody can still be heard, not from the river itself, but from just beyond it, where sound and silence meet without conflict, the echo of a song that never reached its destination, yet continues to exist in the act of not arriving.